The freezing rain of late November hammered against the cedar planks of my front porch in rainy Portland, the sound a chaotic static that drowned out the distant highway. I stood in the open doorway, the cold air immediately cutting through the heavy canvas of my dark work jacket. The yellow light from the twin porch sconces spilled over the concrete steps, illuminating a scene that forced a hard, sudden stop in my chest. Two women stood huddled together in the relentless downpour, shivering so violently their shoulders jerked. On the left, Aurora Evans was soaked to the bone, her light brown hair plastered in wet streaks across her pale cheeks. She wore a thin, white-wrapped top that offered absolutely zero thermal protection against the Pacific Northwest storm. Beside her, clutching Aurora's arm like a lifeline, was her younger sister, Sadie, wearing a maroon top underneath a saturated overshirt. The sheer panic in their eyes cut through the dark.
"Can we stay here tonight?" Aurora asked, her voice shaking, barely carrying over the sound of the rain hitting the gutters. I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask why the 36-year-old owner of the architectural restoration studio down the street was standing on my porch at 10 o'clock at night. I just stepped back and pulled the heavy oak door open wider. "I only have one bed," I replied, my voice perfectly level, aiming for maximum practical clarity. "Sadie can take the pull-out couch in the living room. Aurora, you take my room. I'll take the recliner." Aurora blinked, water dripping from her eyelashes. She looked like she expected an argument or a demand for an explanation. I didn't offer one. I simply gestured inside. They crossed the threshold, leaving a trail of water on the hardwood floor. I shut the door, sealing the storm outside, and the sudden quiet in the hallway felt heavy. I walked straight to the hall closet, pulling out 3 thick, dry towels. I handed them over in silence. Sadie wrapped one around her head immediately, her teeth clicking together. Aurora took hers slowly, her knuckles white as she gripped the cotton fabric. "Vance locked us out," Sadie muttered from beneath her towel, the words spilling out in a rush of anxiety. "He showed up at 8, chained the doors to the studio and the upstairs apartment. He gave us a concrete notice, 48 hours to clear our equipment out or he claims it all." I looked at Aurora. She had spent the last 3 years building that restoration firm from nothing. It was her entire life. Now, she just stared at the floorboards, the fight temporarily drained out of her. I walked into the kitchen, my boots quiet against the floor, and turned on the electric kettle. "Go dry off," I said, setting 3 ceramic mugs on the granite island. "They're clean sweatpants in the bottom drawer of the dresser. We will map a step-by-step plan in the morning." She finally looked up, her gaze catching mine. There was a deep, lingering mistrust in her eyes, an inner wound left over from a previous business partner who had financially ruined her, making her assume every offered hand had a hidden cost. I didn't push. I just handed her a warm mug of tea. The transfer of stability was immediate. The shaking in her hands eased as the heat anchored her. The next morning, the rain had reduced to a steady, quiet drizzle. I woke up at 5, my neck stiff from the leather recliner, and went to the kitchen to start the coffee maker. The smell of dark roast filled the apartment. By the time I sat down at the drafting table in the corner of my living room, Aurora emerged from the hallway. She was wearing my gray sweatpants, the hem rolled up 3 times, and an oversized shirt. She walked over and placed a crumpled, damp piece of paper on the drafting table directly over my schematics. "This is the notice Vance taped to the door." I adjusted my glasses and flattened the document. It was a formal notice to vacate, citing a critical structural hazard. The letter claimed the load-bearing floor joists in her ground-level studio were failing, rendering the entire unit legally uninhabitable. I read the specific municipal codes Vance's attorney had cited. A familiar, quiet focus settled over my mind. "He's lying," I said, tapping the second paragraph with my drafting pencil. Aurora crossed her arms, a defensive posture holding her together.
I know he's lying, Remy. The floor only sagged because of the massive, unpermitted commercial water tanks he dragged onto the second-floor utility room last week. No, I mean, he's legally lying, I corrected, looking up at her. I'm a structural engineer. The municipal code he referenced, Ordinance 12.3, only applies to foundational failure originating from the tenant's misuse. The deflection criteria for a commercial floor span is L over 360.
A localized sag from a second-story point load falls under landlord negligence. He is attempting to use his own structural damage as grounds to terminate your below-market lease. Aurora stared at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. Are you sure? His lawyer's letterhead looks impenetrable. I don't have the capital for a protracted legal battle. I can't. She stopped, swallowing hard. You don't need a lawyer today, I said, closing my laptop and standing up. You need a licensed assessment. We're going to the studio. An hour later, the three of us stood on the wet sidewalk outside the brick facade of Aurora's studio. The front double doors were wrapped in a heavy steel chain. Vance, a man who wore his greed like a cheap suit, was standing near the alleyway, talking to a private contractor. When he saw us, his expression hardened. You're trespassing, Aurora, Vance called out, stepping forward to block the entrance. The building is condemned. Read the notice. I stepped slightly in front of Aurora, not to diminish her, but to draw Vance's focus. Mr. Vance, I said, my tone flat, devoid of any aggression or ego. My name is Remy Burns. I'm a licensed structural engineer. I'm here to conduct a visual hazard assessment. Vance stopped. You don't have authorization to enter a condemned site. I didn't argue. I pulled my phone from my pocket and brought up the municipal permitting database. According to city records, you haven't filed a condemnation order, nor did you pull a permit for the 2-ton water tank sitting directly above Miss Evans' studio. If you restrict access to a valid leaseholder without a city inspector's presence, you are committing an illegal lockout. Open the door or I report an unpermitted point load hazard that threatens public safety right now. Vance's jaw clenched. He looked at the phone, then at his contractor, who suddenly found the pavement very interesting. Vance didn't say a word. He pulled a keyring from his belt, unlocked the heavy padlock, and walked away. I turned to Aurora. She was looking at me with a complex expression, a mixture of shock and tentative relief. I didn't smile or wait for applause. I simply pushed the glass door open. After you. The next few days settled into a quiet, intense rhythm inside my apartment. Sadie went to stay with a friend across town, leaving Aurora and me navigating the forced proximity. During the day, Aurora set up her laptop at my kitchen island, fielding calls from panicked clients and trying to manage her restoration projects remotely. In the evenings, I sat at my illuminated drafting table, pulling municipal blueprints of her building and running load-bearing calculations. I found myself adjusting to her presence. The apartment, usually a silent, utilitarian space, felt different. One evening, she left a small brass ruler on the edge of my drafting desk. I noticed it sitting over a schematic. Instead of handing it back and breaking her concentration, I quietly opened my top desk drawer and placed it inside, keeping it safe for her. I kept my hands in my pockets as I walked past her chair, the urge to rest a hand on her shoulder heavy, but I maintained the distance out of absolute respect for her boundaries. On Thursday night, the rain started again. I spread the printed architectural blueprints across the kitchen island right next to her laptop. Vance claimed the lateral support in your ceiling was failing, I said, pointing a pencil at the structural schematics. But the original 1920s blueprints show this building was retrofitted with steel I-beams. The sheer stress he documented in the photographs isn't from age. It's from the specific, concentrated weight of the unpermitted tanks. I mapped a step-by-step counter-assessment. I set the pencil down. He's hiding his own violations to flip the building. Aurora looked up from her screen,
the persistent tension in her jaw finally uncoiling. The panic that had been clouding her face for 4 days dissolved into a profound, quiet relief. She let out a shaky exhale. "You found all this just by reading the old archives?" she asked quietly. "It's just math," I said, though seeing the weight lift from her shoulders felt far more significant than a solved equation. But the relief was fractured 48 hours later. Friday afternoon, a courier knocked on the door. He handed Aurora a thick manila envelope. I watched from the kitchen as she opened it. The color drained from her face completely. The papers slipped from her fingers, scattering across the hardwood floor. I walked over and picked up the top page. It was a formal, court-stamped notice of termination. Vance had bypassed the local housing authority and filed an expedited injunction claiming Aurora's restoration chemicals were the actual cause of the floor degradation. He had a corrupt private inspector sign off on it. She had exactly 2 days to vacate permanently, or the sheriff would physically remove her property. Aurora didn't scream. She just stood perfectly still, her breathing shallow and rapid. "It's over," she whispered, staring at the blank wall. "He has the money. He manufactured the proof. I can't fight a court order, Remy. I should just pack and go back to Seattle." The absolute defeat in her voice triggered a sharp drop in my stomach. She turned toward the guest room, ready to surrender. I stepped closer, intercepting her path. She was shaking, a silent internal tremor. I didn't offer a motivational speech. I just reached out and pulled her against my chest. I didn't hold her with romantic intent. I held her using the principle of the quiet room. As my arms wrapped around her shoulders, I focused entirely on blocking out the noise, the panic, the overwhelming rush of the eviction clock. I stood perfectly still, acting as a physical shield against the chaos. Slowly, the frantic rhythm of her breathing began to sync with my steady, measured breaths. The physical contact was a transfer of stability, a grounding wire keeping her tethered to reality. "We are not done," I said quietly, my voice rumbling against her ear. "He made a mistake filing this officially. He put his forged claims on the public record." I stepped back, deliberately giving her space so she wouldn't feel trapped. I walked over to the printer, pulled up a blank calendar, and printed it. I grabbed a pen and began writing concrete steps into the dates. "I am scheduling an emergency inspection with the chief city engineer for Monday at noon," I said, sliding the paper across the island toward her. "I will present the counter data. We are dealing strictly in municipal facts." Aurora looked at the calendar. The word "we" was written in dark ink. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. She didn't say she was scared, and she didn't apologize for panicking. She just nodded, accepting the tether. The weekend was a grueling test of endurance. I turned my longing into discipline. I didn't try to initiate deep emotional conversations. I stayed up until 3 a.m. running continuous 3D stress test simulations on my laptop, formatting the raw data into a legally undeniable engineering report. Every time Aurora woke up to get water, she saw me sitting there, steady and working. I was building a fortress out of paper and math. Monday arrived with gray skies and a biting wind. We stood in the empty restoration studio, the air smelling faintly of old wood and varnish. Vance stood across the room looking smug alongside his attorney and the private inspector he had hired. Between us stood Marcus Thorne, the senior city building inspector, a man known for his absolute lack of humor and strict adherence to code. "Mr. Burns claims this expedited eviction is based on fraudulent structural data," Thorne said, looking at Vance. "Let's see the evidence." I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I unrolled the master blueprints and my newly printed simulation models on the large oak work table. "Inspector Thorne," I began, pointing to the structural load paths. "The landlord claims the tenant's restoration chemicals degraded the subfloor. However, The degradation pattern is entirely mechanical, not chemical. The deflection angle of the joists is precisely 4.2 degrees downward. I handed Thorne the thick packet of calculations. This matches the exact dead load stress of a 4,000-pound water tank placed directly over a non-load-bearing span on the second floor. The shear cracks in Miss Evans' ceiling prove the stress is descending from the unpermitted roof tanks, not ascending from her floor. Thorne adjusted his glasses, flipping through my calculations.
He walked over to the wall, inspected the cracks with a flashlight, and then looked at the ceiling. He turned back to Vance, his expression turning to stone. "You installed 2 tons of water storage on an unreinforced span without a permit?" Thorne asked, his voice deadly quiet. Vance shifted uncomfortably, the smugness evaporating. "It was a temporary utility replacement. It is a catastrophic code violation," Thorne interrupted sharply. He pulled Vance's court-stamped eviction notice from his clipboard, took out a heavy black pen, and wrote "Void" across the front in massive letters. He effectively scrapped the contract right there. "This eviction is dismissed. Furthermore, Mr. Vance, you are being cited for hazardous, unpermitted construction. You have 7 days to remove the tanks at your expense, and the city will be auditing your other properties." Vance's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He opened his mouth to argue, but his lawyer put a firm hand on his arm, shaking his head. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the studio. The heavy silence that followed was entirely different from the silence of the past few weeks. It was the silence of a finished war. Thorne tipped his hard hat to me, nodded respectfully to Aurora, and exited the building. I began rolling up the blueprints. I expected Aurora to cheer or maybe to hug me. Instead, she walked over to the work table, her posture completely transformed. She stood tall, the defensive walls she had carried for weeks entirely gone. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "I need to speak to the city property management office," Aurora said, her voice steady and clear. "If Vance is facing massive municipal fines, he's going to bleed cash. I am offering to buy out the remainder of this lease at a 40% discount, locked in for 5 years, or I walk and leave him with an empty, red-tagged building." I stopped rolling the paper. I looked at her, truly seeing the sharp, brilliant, competent woman who had survived everything thrown at her. She didn't need me to speak for her or negotiate her future. She had her leverage, and she knew exactly how to wield it. "Do it," I said, stepping back to give her the floor. 3 weeks later, the Portland rain finally broke, leaving the city washed clean and bright. We sat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of a downtown notary office. Vance sat across the table looking thoroughly defeated, signing the final page of a new, ironclad commercial lease and deed transfer that heavily favored Aurora. Aurora took the pen, signed her name with a sharp, definitive flourish, and pushed the document across the table. She didn't look at Vance. She stood up, gathered her leather bag, and looked at me. "Ready?" "Ready," I replied. We walked out of the office building and onto the bustling street. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the pavement. Aurora stopped near the corner, turning to face me. The chaotic energy of the city moved around us, but right here, in this small space, everything felt incredibly still. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. She held it out to me. "I had an extra cut," she said simply, "for the studio and the apartment upstairs." I looked at the key resting in her palm. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was access. It was trust, freely given by a woman who guarded her independence fiercely. She was signing on to a shared, practical plan in broad daylight. I took the key, my fingers brushing against hers. I didn't put it in my pocket. I kept it in my hand,
feeling the solid weight of it. I stepped closer, closing the final inch of distance between us. I didn't ask for permission with words. I simply lowered my head, and she tilted hers up, meeting me halfway. The kiss wasn't an exploration. It was a destination. It felt like dropping a heavy anchor in a safe harbor after months of wandering. It was the heavy, undeniable certainty of a promise sealed without a single spoken word. When I finally pulled back, resting my forehead against hers, the chaotic noise of the world was perfectly, completely blocked out. Love isn't about holding on tight to maintain control. It's about knowing they will come back if you let go. Healthy love doesn't require shrinking yourself. It requires showing up consistently and safely. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.